Yok. Tamam. Bakalım.
O kapıları kapatalım mı yavaş yavaş? Good afternoon. I thank you all for coming to this fourth meeting of ŞEHİR Talks. We are pleased to have with us today Professor Dimitri Gutas. Professor Gutas is one of the few distinguished scholars who are able to competently talk about the place of philosophy in Islamic intellectual tradition. And this topic will be the topic of today's conference. Professor Gutas was born in Cairo into a Greek family of Istanbul origin. He grew up and went to school in Istanbul in the 1950s and 60s, graduating from Robert Academy in 1965. He then did his BA and PhD at Yale University. Since 1989, he has been professor of Arabic and Greco-Arabic at Yale's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He has a lot of works, books and articles on this subject. Among his works are Greek wisdom literature in Arabic translation, a study of the Greco-Arabic gnomology. I'm sorry. And I think this book is available in Turkish also. Avicenna and the Aristotelian Tradition, Introduction to Reading Avicenna's Philosophical Works, a Greek and Arabic lexicon, materials for a dictionary of the medieval translations from Greek into Arabic, Greek thought, Arabic culture, this is available in Turkish, Greek philosophers in the Arabic tradition, and finally, İbn Sina'nın Mirası. It is available in Turkish. I'm glad to present to you Professor Dimitri Gutas. His Turkish is perfect. Actually, it's better than our Turkish because he is an Istanbullu for about 7 generations. So you may ask your questions in Turkish, but his speech will be in English. Let's welcome him.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here, to be speaking at my hometown and to this magnificent audience. I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity. Today I will talk, as my colleague said, about the centrality of philosophy in the pre-modern Islamic intellectual tradition. It is a subject that still has not received the attention that it deserves for various reasons. We can discuss them at the end of the talk. So I want, with my talks, to emphasize the fact that philosophy in the pre-modern Islamic intellectual tradition was a deeply ingrained intellectual pursuit. So I will begin just to set the tone with a 14th century text that is, I believe, quite representative of my subject. It is found in the biographies of Shafi'i scholars, Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya, written by one of the pillars of Sunni orthodoxy, Tajuddin al-Subki, an Egyptian Syrian Shafi'i religious scholar and judge who died in 1370. In his biography of Seyfettin al-Amidi, an earlier Syrian Shafi'i theologian, who died in 1233, he says the following, and I will read what he says about al-Amidi. He says, Al-Amidi saw in his dream the proof of Islam, Hujjat al-Islam, yani al-Ghazali, lying in a coffin. He uncovered his face and kissed him. When he woke up, he resolved to learn something about al-Ghazali's works, and in a few days, he learned by heart his Al-Mustasfa, which is, of course, as we know, a major work introducing the fundamentals of Islamic law. When Al-Amidi himself died, one of his relatives saw him in a dream and asked him, "What has God done with you?" Al-Amidi replied, "He asked me to take a seat, and then God told me the following, 'Prove my oneness and the majesty of my angels.' I replied, 'A temporal being that has been created most perfectly must have a creator. Now, the second and the third have the same relation to the first as the third and the fourth to their preceding number in a series. And since from the one only one can proceed, what is beyond this is more than can be accomplished or claimed by a contingent being that is created. Therefore, everything would have been non-existent had there been no one necessary being that would be the cause of all creation. And therefore, only the one has everlasting existence. Great is his majesty, Jalla Jalaluhu. Then God spoke to me and he said, 'Go to paradise.'" End of the quotation. Now, this argument here about the oneness of God that satisfies God himself, Allah, is the one set forth in detail by the great philosopher, of course, of the Islamic world, Ibn Sina. I will refer to it later in my talk. What is significant here is that respectable and orthodox Muslim men of religion, when they were asked to prove the oneness of Allah, had recourse to a philosophical argument instead of the most obvious source, the Quran itself. Indeed, in Surah 112, the Quran says explicitly, "Say, He is God, one. Qul huwallahu ahadun." So if I were in a position of those theologians and was asked by God to prove his oneness, I would have immediately said, "Your Majesty, you say so yourself in your book. What better proof than this could you need?" But the theologians I'm referring to prefer to use a philosophical argument, which they believed also pleased God, because Al-Amidi was then ordered by God to go to paradise. By the 14th century, philosophy had gained such a central position in Islamic intellectual life. I will now discuss the background and the nature of these developments in the following 4 parts of my talk. First, a definition of what philosophy in the Islamic world is. Second, a brief survey of the rebirth of philosophy in the Abbasid Baghdad in the 9th century, because the origins of this intellectual tradition very much influenced its subsequent development. Third, a brief account of the contents of this philosophy. And fourth, my subject proper, its centrality. Philosophy in the Islamic world is the immediate heir of Greek philosophy in late antiquity, and as such constitutes a significant segment of the history of Western philosophy. It was written predominantly in the language of culture of Islamic civilization, Arabic, and in later centuries, partly also in a heavily Arabicized Persian, by philosophers of various religious and ethnic backgrounds. It was not an Islamic philosophy, as it is frequently and mistakenly referred to, in the sense that neither its contents nor its methodology reflects specific Islamic doctrine. It has a history of close to 10 centuries in the pre-colonial Islamic world, and its influence is still perceptible in some intellectual traditions, especially among Shiite scholars in Iran, and in a modern revival of what is claimed to be Averroist rationalism in Morocco. The study of Arabic philosophy by Westerners, and also to some extent by some scholars from the Muslim world who adopted Western attitudes, has fared rather poorly in the 20th century and has suffered by, there is no kinder word for it, racist bias, as has other Orientalist scholarship on Islam and the Arabs. The different approaches to this philosophy, Orientalist in the negative sense of the term, mystical, or Straussian, boil down to a few basic components. It is claimed that the Arabs, or Muslims, Orientals in the 19th century sense of the term, cannot think in terms of reason, but only in terms of religion, so that all their philosophy is either simply borrowed from the Greeks, eventually to be transferred to Western Latins who knew how to appreciate it, or is mystical in its orientation, or it is political in the sense that it was concerned only with the relationship of religion in an attempt to circumvent it, to go around it. I'm glad to say that these approaches, for the most part, are now debunked, though their influence still persists, creating much of the confusion about the subject, especially among the general educated public. And I can discuss some of these if you are interested at the end of the talk. The second part, the history of philosophy in the Islamic world as an intellectual discipline of the same nature as Greek philosophy, is very much determined by its origins, which I will now briefly describe. As a result of historical developments in the Greek-speaking world in late antiquity, philosophy as living practice died before the rise of Islam. The death of philosophy can be placed, if it were possible to give a precise date to such matters, around 600 AD, when, according to tradition, the Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium invited to Constantinople the last philosopher in Alexandria, Stephanus. After this date, we hear of no philosophical activity in either city or elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world of late antiquity. Furthermore, there was no philosophical activity during this period in any other language. There was nothing in Latin after Boethius, who died in 525, until much, much later, and nothing in Persian, Middle Persian, pre-Islamic Persian, as far as we know. The Syriac tradition may be considered an exception insofar as some translation and commenting of Greek philosophical texts, mainly of logic, was carried on at this time, but this activity was primarily pedagogical in nature and reproductive of the curriculum, not creatively philosophical. For all practical purposes, Greek philosophy was dead and buried. The resurrection of Greek philosophy as Arabic philosophy is intimately connected with the Greco-Arabic translation movement that started in Baghdad shortly after its foundation in 762 and lasted well until the end of the 10th century. This translation movement, during the course of which almost all non-literary and non-historical secular Greek works on science and philosophy were translated upon demand into Arabic, was introduced by the caliphs and the ruling elite of the newly established Arab Abbasid dynasty, Abbasiler, from 750 to 1258, as an ideological response to pressing political and social problems. Once thus introduced and sponsored from the top, the translation movement found further support from below by the beginning scientific tradition in Arabic, which was developing at the hands of scholars and scientists actively recruited to the capital by the same elite who were commissioning the translations. The dialectic between scientific thinking and research on the one hand and the translation activity on the other was responsible for the amazingly rapid development of the mathematical sciences in Arabic in the second half of the 8th century and their establishment as a major cultural force in early Abbasid society. The significance of mathematics in this prose manifested itself in a variety of ways. In the first place, our evidence indicates that in all likelihood, the very first science that was actively pursued by the Abbasid elite was astrology, as a means to control political attitudes and expectations through the forecasting of the future as predetermined in a way that was favorable to the new rulers, the Abbasid dynasty. Astrologers need to be experts in astronomy and mathematics, whence the significance of the book known as the Almagest by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy, Bathlamius, which was translated early. But the Almagest also presents mathematics as the one true method to arrive at the truth, the methods employed by theology and physics being too inexact and uncertain. Secondly, the book called Elements by the geometer Euclid, the foundational book of geometry, was also translated into Arabic very early, almost certainly before 775. Both as a book and as a science, it permeated various areas of cultural activity, including Islamic theology, whose cosmology was based on atomism. That is, the cosmology of early Islamic theology was based on atomism. Geometry appears to have been introduced into theological discussions to explain how atomism works. A point, according to Euclid's geometry, a point, nocta, that has no parts is very much like the atom. And the extension of points into lines, lines into plane surfaces, and planes into bodies is what generates the three dimensions of reality. Al-Kindi, who died after 870, the first scientist to develop philosophical thought as such in Arabic, was a polymath in the translated sciences and very much a product of his age. Like other scientists of his time, he gathered around him a wide circle of individuals capable of advising him on these issues and translating the relevant texts. He commissioned translations of scientific subjects and himself wrote on all the sciences: astrology, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, music, medicine. He even has a treatise on swords. As scientific method, Al-Kindi's goal was to approach mathematical accuracy in his argumentation because, following Euclid and Ptolemy, as I just described, he held mathematical or geometrical proof to be of the highest order. In his philosophical writings, he regularly employed certain proofs where his method was quite clearly derived from the elements of Euclid. He said that a prerequisite for the study of Aristotle's philosophy, even of logic, was mathematics. In this perception, he appears to have been influenced directly by the Greek philosopher of the 5th century, Proclus. Proclus's book, Elements of Theology, with its geometrical mode of argumentation, was living proof for Al-Kindi that abstract problems, such as those debated by the theologians of his time, could be resolved through philosophical discussion proceeding on the basis of a geometrical methodology, just like the rest of the sciences. Proclus thus appears to be the link which connected Al-Kindi's geometrical epistemology with philosophy. In other words, geometry introduced Al-Kindi to Proclus, who introduced him to philosophy. Once introduced to philosophy by Proclus in this fashion, and hence to the possibility that theological questions can be treated with an amount of certainty equal to that in the mathematical sciences, Al-Kindi gained access to this methodologically rigorous discipline, philosophy, by commissioning translations of Greek metaphysical texts, foremost among which are the selections from Plotinus and Proclus in Arabic, known respectively as the Theology of Aristotle, the Athologia, and the Pure Good, and Aristotle's Metaphysics. Al-Kindi and the circle of scholars he gathered around him further commissioned translations of other Greek works, both philosophical and scientific. But the core of his philosophical enterprise was centered in the geometrical approach to the solution of all problems associated with the concept of the one, or the first principle, as discussed by Plotinus and Proclus. On the basis of problems and methods of study current in his society, he fashioned his own approach from the remnants of Greek philosophy available in the written but not living tradition. This is why his philosophical thinking does not belong to a school tradition, why it does not rest on previous translations of Greek philosophical works, and why it is an original creation in Arabic of the intellectualism of early Abbasid society. Al-Kindi's work both introduced philosophy to, or resurrected it for, the new social environment of Abbasid Baghdad by making it relevant to its intellectual concerns, and he made it widely acceptable as the indispensable means for serious and rigorous thinking. After Al-Kindi, the cause of philosophy was taken up by a new generation of thinkers, foremost among whom was Al-Farabi, he died in 950, who established philosophy as one of the major intellectual currents in Baghdad, from where it spread to the rest of the Islamic world. The social and intellectual environment in early Abbasid Baghdad that enabled and sustained the resurrection of philosophy is crucial for an understanding of the role that philosophy played in Islamic societies throughout the centuries. In the first place, and most importantly, philosophy was introduced as an independent discipline in the mix of various sciences struggling for supremacy in Abbasid intellectual life. Although it was introduced, as I just mentioned, in the wake of Al-Kindi's mathematical concerns and in the process of epistemological investigations and the search for method, it was not attached or subservient to any discipline, despite the fact that it had natural affinities and allies in disciplines like medicine and mathematics, and was in constant dialogue with Islamic theology, Kalam. Second, and as a corollary of the first, philosophy was introduced in a society where a strict monotheistic religion was the dominant ideology, but philosophy appeared neither in opposition to religion nor as subservient to religion. It was not, in other words, a maidservant of theology, as in the Latin West later, but it, as a discipline actually above religion, all religions, which it was in a position to understand and explain as worldly, as social and psychological phenomena. And thirdly, it gained its validity and authority by being demonstrably international and non-sectarian. It was of foreign origin to the Arabs, but because of this, it did not belong to any particular or sectarian group. And individuals of diverse backgrounds in Islamic societies found a common voice under its aegis. It was, to put it in modern terms, scientific. One of the definitions of philosophy in late antique Greek philosophy was that it was a study of the real nature of things. This definition, translated early into Arabic and known to everybody who had even the most rudimentary education, was taken to heart in Islamic societies. Coming now to the contents of this philosophy, that is, the subjects that were treated within its purview, they consisted of the philosophical curriculum that was adopted by the Baghdad Aristotelians. This curriculum followed the classification of the sciences current in Alexandria in late antiquity, a classification that had developed from that of Aristotle's works. Aristotle's organon, including the rhetoric and the poetics, and prefaced by Porphyry's Isagoge, introduction, constituted the canonical 9 books of logic, the instrument of philosophy. Philosophy proper was then divided into theoretical and practical. Theoretical philosophy was further subdivided into physics, mathematics, and metaphysics. It is natural science, physics in a modern sense, but as natural science, mathematics, and metaphysics. And practical philosophy was divided into ethics, economics, it is household management, and management of the city. This entire curriculum was translated into Arabic upon demand. The demand came from various quarters of the Abbasid educated classes, but notably from these philosophers who in many instances also prepared the translations themselves. The entire corpus of Aristotle's writings, with the exception of the politics, some of the zoological books, and some psychological books, together with a whole range of commentaries from the Alexander of Aphrodisias onwards, a philosopher in the 1st century AD, were established as the Arabic curriculum of school textbooks in all these parts of philosophy. The development of philosophy in the Islamic world was varied, as is to be expected. Very briefly, we can see that the various strands of incipient philosophical thinking were eventually united in a grand synthesis in the work of Avicenna, Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina's work, because it addressed itself to real concerns of Islamic intellectual life, including theological concerns, because it was written in an Arabic that was familiar to Muslim scholars of his time, and because it possessed unparalleled authority due to the extreme rigor and power of its theses and arguments, dominated Islamic intellectual life until, well, the modern era. The logic of Aristotle, as reworked by Avicenna and his later commentators, penetrated into the very heart of theological and juridical methodologies, and as an independent discipline, logic was taught in this way in Ottoman madrasas until the 20th century, and is still being taught in traditional schools in Iran. Philosophers after him defined their stands with reference to his own philosophy, to Ibn Sina's philosophy. They were either his followers, or his direct opponents, or his reformers. By the same token, and due to Ibn Sina's liking of logic, physics, and metaphysics in his works and his neglect of the practical sciences, ethics especially, and management of the city, these sciences developed independently of the main philosophical tradition, just as did the mathematical sciences in the hands of the mathematicians and astronomers. But philosophy, in its traditional entirety, became the dominant form of intellectual pursuit throughout the post-Avicenna era in the Islamic world, and it was actively cultivated by all Islamic states which found themselves in possession of economic and military power, be they the Ottomans in Asia Minor and the Middle East, or the Safavids in Iran, or the Mughals in India. Let me now come to the central role which philosophy played during this time and how it related to other disciplines, especially theology. After Ibn Sina, and primarily through the efforts of Al-Ghazali, theology adopted much of the terminology and argumentation of philosophy, as did mysticism through the work of Ibn Arabi. In effect, what took place was the philosophization of theology and mysticism, and not, as usually claimed, the dilution of philosophy into theology and mysticism. The adoption of philosophical ways in works on theology and mysticism, and even in jurisprudence, is indisputable, and it constituted the triumph of philosophy in the Islamic world and the centrality which it acquired in intellectual life. Philosophy itself continued to be practiced as before, though of course always sensitive to the intellectual concerns of the other disciplines that mattered to Islamic intellectuals. As a matter of fact, the reason why philosophy in the first place gained such an eminent position in Islamic societies after Ibn Sina is precisely because Ibn Sina made it to be concerned about issues of importance to them, as I just mentioned. It is thus one thing to say that philosophy also treated issues that were central to theology and mysticism, and another to suggest that these disciplines fused together because the treatment of these issues remained philosophical. I will now call upon two historical witnesses to support my thesis of the independence of philosophy, and then have a look at one instance as an example where the different approaches and argumentation of philosophy and theology become evident. My first witness is the great historian and father of modern history and sociology from the west of the Islamic world, Ibn Khaldun, of course, who died in 1406. Ibn Khaldun faced the same problem in his account of the development of the sciences in Islamic civilization as he set it forth in his masterpiece, The Introduction to History, the Muqaddimah. Confronted with the confusion in laymen's minds between theology and philosophy because of the philosophical turn of theology and the new way of writing theology inaugurated by Al-Ghazali and others whom he calls the later scholars, he explained as follows how the methods and purposes of theology and philosophy differ. And I quote from Ibn Khaldun: "The later scholars," meaning Al-Ghazali and later scholars, were very intent upon meddling with philosophical works. The subjects of the two disciplines, theology and philosophy, were thus confused by them. They thought that there was one and the same subject in both disciplines because the problems of each discipline were similar. It should be known, however, that the theologians most often deduced the existence and the attributes of the Creator from the existing things and their conditions. As a rule, this was their line of argument. The physical bodies form part of the existing things, and they are the subject of the philosophical study of physics, natural science. However, the philosophical study of them differs from the theological. The philosophers study bodies insofar as they move or are stationary, that is, with reference to motion. The theologians, on the other hand, study bodies insofar as they serve as an argument for God who makes them. In the same way, the philosophical study of metaphysics studies existence as such and what existence is in itself, the concept of existence. The theological study of metaphysics, on the other hand, ilahiyat, is concerned with the things that exist insofar as they serve as an argument for him who causes the existence, for God. In general, to the theologians, the subject of theology is to find out how the articles of faith which the religious law has laid down as correct can be proven with the help of logical arguments so that innovations may be repulsed and doubts and misgivings concerning the articles of faith be removed. Nevertheless, the two approaches have been mixed up by recent scholars. The problems of theology have been confused with those of philosophy. This has gone so far that the one discipline is no longer distinguishable from the other. End of the quotation from Ibn Khaldun. I will draw your attention to the crucial distinction Ibn Khaldun is drawing here between the aims and methods of philosophy and theology. Philosophers, he says, study bodies insofar as they move or are stationary, that is, try to find out what their essential characteristics are. In other words, they are what we would call today scientists. The theologians, on the other hand, study bodies insofar as they serve as an argument to prove the existence of God. In the same way, the philosophical study of metaphysics studies existence or being as such and what its conditions are in itself. This is nothing else but a restatement of Aristotle's definition of metaphysics as the study of being as being. The theological study of metaphysics, on the other hand, Ibn Khaldun says, is concerned with existence insofar as it serves as argument for God who causes existing things and grants being. My next witness, the second one, is slightly later and comes from the east of the Islamic world. It is no less a personality than the brilliant poet and scholar Al-Jami, whose life spans the entire 15th century, 1414-1492. He was confronted with the same confusion about the respective fields of inquiry of three disciplines: philosophy, theology, and mysticism, tasawwuf. A confusion that was expressed by no less a layman than our very own Fatih Sultan Mehmet, who requested from him to compose a treatise showing precisely how these three disciplines differ from each other. Al-Jami did this in a treatise which he called the Precious Pearl, Ad-Durra al-Fakhira, which took the form of an adjudication or impartial judgment, a muhakama, among the three positions on the questions of God's existence and unity, his attributes, and the emanation of the world from him. Al-Jami is partial to the mystics, given his background and training, but he's also fair in his representation of the respective positions on these issues. A first reading of his text generates astonishment. The different positions of the three disciplines are expressed in a highly technical philosophical language and argumentation that cannot be distinguished on any formal level, especially when one compares this language with the language of theology and mysticism before Ibn Sina. The philosophization of theology and mysticism, at the discursive level at least, is thus complete. However, Ibn Khaldun, in his account of the differences between the two disciplines at least, theology and philosophy, drew attention to their fundamental difference in aim and method. And this is evident in the positions of the theologians and mystics in Al-Jami's account, which at one point, in order to achieve their aim of proving the articles of faith regarding God and his attributes, have recourse to what may be called leaps of faith. As an example, let me refer to the discussion Al-Jami presents on the question of the emanation of many things from the One. This was always a philosophical problem. If God is one and he's the creator of everything, as the Islamic theology claims, how can we have many things proceed from the One? How can you have multiplicity from unity? This was always a philosophical problem. How do we get from the one to the many? The theologians, Al-Jami says, maintain that all of the innumerable contingent beings are immediately dependent on God, even though God himself is not a composite being. God is absolutely simple. The philosophers, on the other hand, denied the possibility of dependence of numerous effects on a single cause, except through the multiplicity of intermediaries. That is, in Neoplatonic terms, through the intellects of the celestial spheres around the earth, by means of which the emanation of being from God reaches earth. It is to be noted that in the position of the Ash'ari theologians, who state that the contingent beings are immediately, that is, without mediation, dependent on God, the claim of the unity of God is based on such a leap of faith. It is not argued for there can be no argument. Al-Jami necessarily acknowledges this when he says that the true position is that of the philosophers. What the theologians appear to be doing, therefore, is to have appropriated completely the philosopher's vocabulary, arguments, and methods, except that in the crucial points of the main articles of faith, as laid down by the sacred law, they revert to merely positing these articles without arguments, or, as the Ash'arites themselves put it, without explaining how, bila kaifa. Let me give you yet another example precisely on this point, which is illustrative of the varied approaches by philosophy and theology to the central issues discussed by both, as briefly described by Ibn Khaldun. The question of prophecy, nubuwah, is central to Islam as a religion, obviously, as it is, of course, to the other monotheistic religions. The claim to the truth of Islam and the corresponding demand for obedience and belief by Muslims rests squarely on the assumption that Muhammad was indeed the messenger of God to whom were given the very words of God, the Quran. Accordingly, what has been called the proof of prophecy, dalail al-nubuwah, that is, the demonstration of the veracity of the truth of this claim, formed from almost the very beginning one of the central subjects discussed in Islamic theology. In essence, and without going into details, this demonstration rested on a historical argument of continuous witnesses to this fact, tawatur. An unbroken chain of witnesses from the time of the Prophet to the present, the central piece of the argument went, attests to the fact that Muhammad did indeed receive the Holy Book from God. The philosophers, naturally, could not be satisfied with this dialectical and contingent argument. To them, the question was not so much whether Muhammad was a true prophet. They knew that religious statements were true for a specific society, but not absolutely true, but whether prophecy as such is possible. That is, whether it is possible for humans to receive information from the divine, from the supernal world, the world above our world. And if it is, what the epistemological mechanisms are that enable and provide this knowledge. The early Baghdad peripatetics, and particularly Al-Farabi, formulated a solution to this problem, which was perfected by Ibn Sina. It rested squarely on the psychology of Aristotle, his theory of the soul, as further developed by Ibn Sina, which explained the ways in which the human theoretical intellect of the Prophet can receive the intelligibles, maqulat, from the intellects of the spheres, and the human practical intellect can receive information from the souls of the spheres, information which then the imaginative faculty, al-mutakhayyila, of the Prophet can convert to metaphorical language that we witness in the holy books and which is accessible to the masses of humanity. If we open a classic of Sunni theology, Al-Mawaqif, that was composed early in the 14th century by the Shafi'i theologian Al-Iji, he died in 1355, we find this very discussion on the issue of prophecy. Following the practice of post-Ibn Sina theologians, Al-Iji also includes in his discussion the opinions of the philosophers on various questions. On the question of prophecy also, he states the position of the philosophers, as I just briefly described, and then proceeds to disagree with it and offer as alternative the traditional theological argument by the chain of continuous witnesses. This is precisely the point of divergence between theology and philosophy. On all issues of no importance, theology had become indistinguishable from philosophy. On the central issues of faith and sacred law, the philosophical method was abandoned for the traditional leap of faith arguments. This then is the reality of the central position which philosophy and philosophical thinking occupied in the intellectual life of post-classical Islamic societies. The articulation of this centrality, that is the expression, the way in which it was expressed, however, was not as explicit and immediate as one would expect, but manifested itself in a variety of ways. It is the ways of this articulation, I believe, that have generated the impression that there had been a fusion in these later centuries between theology and philosophy. To begin with, there occurred a demographic shift in the people engaged with philosophy. One might even call it, in today's terms, a democratization or even globalization of knowledge, in that the ideal of the learned man in these later centuries became the person who could combine all knowledge, both the traditional knowledge and the intellectual knowledge. That is, both the Islamic sciences based on language and history, tradition, and the foreign sciences based on the intellect. In Arabic, this was expressed in the cute pair of rhyming words, naqliyat and aqliyat. Naqli ilimler, aqli ilimler. We find this ideal stated explicitly by the 17th century Ottoman scholar Katip Çelebi, who says, with reference in particular to the 15th and 16th century Ottoman lands, he says, and I quote, "Philosophical sciences also found a brisk market in Asia Minor after the Muslim conquest until the middle period of the Ottoman state. During that era, a man's nobility was commensurate with the extent to which he could acquire and encompass both the intellectual and traditional sciences." End of quotation. Second, the styles of writings, or the genres of writings through which philosophical ideas could be expressed, on the one hand became more hybrid, more mixed, and on the other tended to favor increasingly commentaries, super commentaries, and glosses. In the later centuries, we thus find at least three major kinds of writing, which by their very form give no indication of their content, whether they are, that is, theological or philosophical. These are, first, individual monographs on specific questions, or rather, more like articles than monographs, risala in Arabic. Second, textbooks or compendia covering the entire philosophy or theology. Hikmah in the case of philosophy, usul ad-din in case of theology. And third, commentaries and super commentaries on any previous text considered foundational. The arrangement of the material in these books, and especially in the textbooks, tended to shift from author to author with implications for his purpose and orientation. Research has just begun to investigate this aspect of the extant literature on the subject, and we are not yet in a position to understand how philosophical and theological positions interacted with each other. Third, and this perhaps is what has been researched the least, is the social context in which such works were composed and the expectations which this context placed on the scholars. Needless to say, all three aspects are interrelated. A scholar who writes in a particular genre, in a particular style, whatever his main strength or interest, writes in a genre in a way that meets the discursive expectations of his audience, thus seemingly participating in and contributing to the grand intellectual tradition. What appears relatively clear at this stage, is that whereas in the classical pre-Ibn Sina period, the lines among the various disciplines were relatively clearly drawn, even if one scholar may have contributed to various disciplines, in the post-classical period, these lines are blurred with the result that there was much greater latitude for widely divergent opinions and approaches to be subsumed under one style of writing. This, however, does not indicate a corresponding fusion and amalgamation of the various disciplines. Especially in the case of philosophy and theology, they retain their separate purposes and approaches, even if in general there was a universal adoption of philosophical means of expression and argumentation. Historical research on philosophy in the pre-modern Islamic world has only recently begun after many false starts. In general, the early period has been better studied, though we are still a long way from having critical editions and reliable translations of the major works. In particular, though, the centuries after Ibn Sina have only sporadically and selectively formed the focus of attention. There is much preliminary work that needs to be done, so it can even come to recognize which questions to ask and where to investigate. But I believe the corner has been turned, or is just about to be turned, with the new generation of scholars increasingly investigating the central role of philosophy in pre-modern Islamic societies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Now the floor is open for questions. As I told you before, you can ask in Turkish.
Hocam çok teşekkür ederiz bu ufuk açıcı konuşmadan dolayı. İki sorum olacak. Sizin 20. yüzyılda İslam felsefesindeki temel yaklaşımlara, dominant yaklaşımlara karşı eleştirilerinizi biliyoruz. Bahsettiniz bunlardan zaten. Oryantalistik yaklaşım, mistik yaklaşım ve Straussçu yaklaşım olmak üzere 3 yaklaşıma eleştirileriniz var. Buradan bir takım sizin kendi yaklaşımınıza dair ipuçları ediniyoruz. Siz kendi yaklaşımınızı nasıl tanımlıyorsunuz? Bunu sormak istedim. İkinci sorum da bu kelam, felsefe ve tasavvuf arasındaki sınırların ortadan yavaş yavaş kalkmasına dair sonraki yüzyıllarda. Özellikle yani post-classical period'da biz mütekellimun veya sufiyun dediğimizde yaşayan gruplar olarak onlara atıfta bulunabiliyoruz. Ancak özellikle 14-15. yüzyıldan sonra felasife bir grup olarak, yaşayan bir grup olarak yok. Yani birisi felasife şöyle dedi diye atıfta bulunacaksa hep classical period'a atıfta bulunuyor. İbn Sina'ya ve takipçilerine. Bu durumu nasıl değerlendirirsiniz? Bir de bunu sormak istedim. Teşekkürler.
Peki. Türkçe mi cevap vereyim? İngilizce cevap vereyim. Yeah, the first question, thank you for your questions. Both are very important. The first one about my method. Perhaps I can give you the best indication with an autobiographical answer. Just that is how I came to study philosophy in the Islamic world. And this has to do very much with my teachers, the books that I read that were available when I was a student and starting to investigate. What I found out is that these three approaches that I mentioned, that Junaid repeated, were quite prevalent. Of course, I thought they were also true, because as a student, you trust what your teachers and what the books that you study say. But also there is a great part of me that is a philologist. I like texts. I like ideas, obviously expressed in text as well, and the history of ideas. But I'm also a philologist. I like to look very closely at text and what they say. So I started reading the Arabic texts which these methods and these books explained or talked about. And I saw that there was a great disparity, great difference between what those methods and those books said and what the texts themselves of the Arabic philosophers, Arabic writing philosophers said. And I said to myself, well, who am I going to believe? Am I going to believe a modern scholar, or am I going to believe the author who wrote himself this very text? So I started paying attention to the words of the authors themselves, of Farabi, Ibn Sina, what have you, all these authors, and tried to see, reading the entire work that they wrote, the entire Risale or the entire book, what were they trying to do? Just like anybody, you read a book, and after you're reading it, you understand what the author is trying to do. And I saw that what I understood from what the author said was quite different from what those books said, especially with those approaches. So I, for example, in the mystical tradition of interpretation of philosophy, especially by inaugurated, especially of Ibn Sina, especially inaugurated by the great French scholar Henri Corbin. He lived in the first half of the 20th century, and he was an excellent scholar, very learned, and he had a special relationship with the history of Iran and Iran in an intellectual tradition. And he also edited some of the books of Suhrawardi, etc. But he also wrote, of course, about Ibn Sina. There was a lot of talk about Ibn Sina being a mystical author, that he writes about mysticism. Well, mysticism, from all I knew, and by reading other early mystics, of course, in the history of Islam, Junayd, Kushairi, and everything, and all Hajjaj, of course, An al-Haq, and everything, I saw that, well, Ibn Sina did not express himself like this. And secondly, I noticed that wherever I looked, Ibn Sina always said to understand something, you have to write a syllogism. A syllogism, you know, it has two premises which you put together, and then you reach a conclusion according to Aristotelian logic, basically. If A is B and B is C, the inescapable conclusion is that A is C. So everywhere Ibn Sina repeated the importance, or if you want to have a philosophical understanding of something, you have to have a syllogism. You have to find the middle term in a syllogism. Well, I said, how can somebody who insists on logical analysis be a mystic? None of the mystics that I knew ever said anything of the sort. So then I looked, of course, and as I read more among the philosophers, especially of the first period, the classical period, I saw they all agreed in my understanding of what it is that they were writing, rather than in the understanding of these others. So eventually I realized that these scholars had, how should I call it? I don't want to be negative in this. They had a particular view or idea that they wanted to present, and they started from that idea, and then went and found in the texts whatever was conformable with their preformed idea, rather than starting with the texts and trying to see what the text says. And so I gave up all those theories, and I said, well, let me start reading the texts and see what it is that they say. It's very simple and not very difficult. You just have to read the text. Of course, reading the text is very important because you also have to understand the language, the technical terminology. Philosophy, of course, is a very technical discipline, and you have to know. But once you get into the tradition of that, because, as I said, there is with Kindi, this later I figured out, for Kindi what was important was to have a proof that will be indisputable. Because in his time, you know, all the theologians, the Mu'tazila and the Christian theologians and other theologians, they were talking about how can we prove this and how can we prove that. And of course, if you have especially a Christian and a Muslim arguing, let's say, and each one brings as proof his own holy book, you're not going to get any result, obviously. You know, the Muslims say the Quran is right, the Christian will say the Bible is right, okay, and you leave it there. There is no way that you can get, if that's because the Christian does not accept the Quran as the final say, And of course, the Muslim does not accept the Bible as the final say, so there is no. So Kindi tried to find geometrical proofs, which of course everybody would accept, just as in geometry, if you reach a conclusion, nobody says, no, no, this is not right, because I have another view. It is 2 and 2 is 4, basically, so it's as simple as that. So this then was a rationalist movement in early Baghdad society for various social reasons, I guess we can investigate. And philosophy then gave them the tool, the means by which difficult abstract questions like those discussed in theology and philosophy as well could be resolved that everybody could agree upon. And this is why we see in the very first period a wide variety of scholars from different religions all writing the same kind of philosophy because they agreed about that. So we have Muslims, we have Christians, we have Jews, we have even pagans. The famous Thabit ibn Qurra from Harran, they were the Sabians who were pagans, polytheists, and everybody discussed all these issues in the same language. So philosophy, as I said, was a higher discipline. So I said, all we have to do is try to find the tradition in which these people are speaking, and of course they always referred to the texts which they used to build upon, the Greek philosophical texts that were translated. So you can look at the Greek texts and see what the concepts are. You see how they are translated into Arabic, what variations they may have gotten within the Arabic tradition, and then on that basis you have a very good idea what it is that they are talking about. And then you read the texts and you just form what I call a historical philological understanding of the text. And then you leave aside the theories. I mean, theories are interesting because it's always good to look at things from different viewpoints, but in the end, we have to try and come to a historical understanding of that. So perhaps, I don't know if I can call it the historical philological method, my method, but not just mine. Actually, this is done in almost every other tradition of the history of philosophy. If you study ancient Greek philosophy, that's what they do. They look at the words, they look at the technical terms and how each philosopher uses those terms, what they mean by that, and try to stay away from grand theories as such. So that's what we do. So that's one. The second one is also a very important question for which I don't know the answer. As far as I know, nobody knows the answer, because as I mentioned, this thing has not been studied. It is particularly related to the third final point that I made, the social context. When we write, everybody, regardless if you're a philosopher or a newspaper article writer, anybody who writes, you write for a certain audience, obviously. You're not writing for yourself, you're writing for the audience. And you write in a way that the audience will understand the point of view that you're trying to put across. And you say things in a way that would be understandable, again, to your audience, in the way in which you want them to understand it. If you use certain expressions, or if you use certain words that have different implications in a society in which you're writing, then you will not be understood. You'll be misunderstood, let's say, by your audience. So all writing is dependent in the context, in the social and intellectual context in which a person is writing. So in the later centuries, that's what I made the third point that I tried to make. And this we have not studied as to what were what was the context in terms of intellectual expectations by the audience when somebody wrote philosophy and when somebody wrote theology. Clearly, you are not going to go against articles of faith because, well, nobody really wanted to do that because there was no such belief in any of the philosophers anyway. But if you wanted to prove something in a particular method, you did it, but you did not refer to any predecessors. If you thought they were philosophers as philosophers, you might refer to them as theologians or something, or masters, or sheikhuna, or something like this that you did. The falasifa themselves in later centuries, they gained, and I think Yahya Michaud has some study of this, I don't know if it was published yet, how the word mutafalsif al-falsafa is used in the 12th, 13th century, and from then on, it is not used very much in a positive tone. And we have to investigate exactly what it is that did it. So that's what I say. We have to look at what they wrote, how they wrote it, and what kind of rhetoric they used in doing it. Once we investigate those things, then we'll be in a better position to answer your question. You should work on it yourself, obviously. And it's tabii.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I have a question about the relationship between philosophy and Sufism. And I was going to refer to what you said about Ibn Sina and how maybe Corban's and similar scholars' vision, in my opinion, maybe could be anachronic in that the later Shi'i Sufis have taken up, let's say, the vision in the heart and some concepts and developed them, and that maybe in a vision backward, I mean, in an analysis backwards, he was considered as the founder of that, and so maybe like that. There, I see the relationship between like how philosophy becomes part of the Sufi tradition and how that relation is produced. Could you say something about that? Thank you.
You mean specifically in the Shi'i tradition? In the Shia
I know. That was just one example. That no, my question was general. I mean, there were. I guess that makes two questions, one in the specific and one in the more general.
Oh, in the Sufi tradition as well, what they thought.
Yes.
What they thought. In the Sufi tradition, I don't know, perhaps, I don't want to be unkind to Sufis. I used to like them. I liked the first Sufis up until Qushayri or something, because then they spoke in real intuitive terms, and again, they used all those metaphors and symbols, which really expressed what it is that they wanted to say, and did not use philosophical language for that. So, you have all those early wonderful stories about the early Sufis, like Rabia going to the market with a bucket full of water and a torch in another hand, and she says she wants to put out the fires of hell with the water, and with the torch start burning paradise. So these things will not exist, and that people will love God not in order to avoid hell and in order to go to paradise, but just for the love of God. Now, I mean, I guess one could write a philosophical treatise about that in philosophical language, but one might be wasting his time. I mean, this is, I think, a perfect example of what it was that Rabia wanted to say as such. So I think the later Sufi tradition, exactly for this reason, by people like Ibn Arabi, in a sense, they adopt philosophical language, which I find very difficult to follow myself, because as far as I can understand, and I'm not an authority on this, so please do not either quote me or misunderstand me, but it seems to me that whereas you read a philosopher, and you know he's going from A to B to C to D, you know how his argument is developing, Ibn Arabi starts like this, swifts to that, his terms keep changing constantly, and you have a big mishmash of notions with no end in sight, and presumably from the very beginning you know what it is that he wants to say, but it is not certainly a philosophical argument, something that looks like philosophy. Now, the fact that they said that what they were doing was the true philosophy, well, of course, every tradition simply wants to claim for itself that it is the best, and there is no mystery about that. But even though Ibn Arabi may be the great sheikh at the intellectual level, still in later periods, mysticism and tasawwuf became much more concerned with the tariqats, and we're having, of course, the fraternities, etc., which, again, depended not so much on these mystical treatises of somebody like Ibn Arabi, but just on the practice that was involved in these tariqat, and following, of course, the master, etc., in that sense. As for the Shiite tradition and the which wanted to claim again philosophy, again, starting from the philosophy of Ibn Sina, what happened in that tradition, they picked certain elements of Ibn Sina's philosophy, which were conformable with what it is that they wanted to say, and they pushed those forward, and hence they said, well, this is a philosophy as well, although of course it was again theology. The problem is not, well, there is no problem here, except that I might not blame, but say that the cause of these later traditions and mixing them up maybe also with Ibn Sina himself, because he wrote himself in a variety of styles, depending on what he wanted to do, the audience, again, that he wanted to reach. And because I think he really wanted everybody to have a philosophical understanding of reality, as he did, and to propagate his view, his philosophical views, he wrote in different styles that would be accessible to different groups of people. And particularly in his last major work, Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, what he does is first he writes regular philosophical prose, but very condensed. And that's why he calls it Al-Isharat. It is a hint. It is a pointer. He points to something. He doesn't give the full argument. And if you read, you'll find continuously he says, well, you should know or you should figure out that this is the case and everything. Never gives the full argument. And of course, in order to find out, you have to go to the Shifa and read the corresponding passage. But in addition to this, he uses, especially towards the end of the Isharat, in the 9th and 10th namats, he uses some vocabulary which is taken from Sufi literature as well. And this, of course, on the one hand, made it accessible to people who had a more mystical inclination, and on the other, it was very easy for people to take only those parts and say, well, it is mystical in that sense. So he may have been responsible partially because he wrote in those styles, but also the later tradition wanted to take a piece of Ibn Sina, because everybody wanted to take a piece of Ibn Sina, and therefore selected those parts that were conformal with their own views. Yes, please.
İbn Tufeil'in Haybin Yaksan romanının girişinde bir geriye dönük felsefe tarihi anlatımı yapıyor ve yani zihnim beni yanıltmıyorsa burada ikili bir ayrım getiriyor. Bir taraftan yani İbn Sina'yı olumlu bir yaklaşımla sunarken diğer taraftan Farabi'yi şiddetle eleştiriyor. Bu anlamda felsefenin mistikleşme sürecinin bu kırılma noktasından mı okuyoruz? Nasıl görüyorsun? Bir de bir şey daha soracağım. Şimdi İbn Sina'nın Haybin Yaksan diye bir başka çalışması da var. O anlamda İbn Sina'nın hem yazı tarzı, ifade biçimi olarak silojizmi kullandığından bahsettik. Bu anlamda mesela bu tarz bir roman acaba İbn Sina'nın kendisinin de bizzat mistik bir felsefe ürettiği tezine doğrulamıyor mu? Yoksa buradaki isnadı konusundan bir başka bağlam var. Onu bir açıkla kavuşturun.
Yeah, this is a well-known problem, which again has not been very properly, I think, understood by most Western scholars for a number of reasons, primarily because the way in which Ibn Tufayl presents his material was conducive to an Orientalist understanding of mysticism in Ibn Sina. So it's, here it is, so they liked it because of that. But let me come to your question. What Ibn Tufayl does in the introduction to the Haybin Yaksan is essentially to try and put together what was perceived as the two different approaches to philosophy by Ibn Sina, certainly, and by Ghazali. Because Ghazali's tahafut was known by the time, and of course in Al-Andalus. As a matter of fact, Ghazali was not very much liked. And in a sense, it's interesting to see that Ibn Tufayl seems to mention him well, in a sense, because, as you know, Ghazali's books were burned by the Maliki scholars in Al-Andalus. So we have that one as well, as such. But because Ibn Tufayl knew, of course, of the authority of Ibn Sina, so he could not dismiss him. Farabi, because he was an earlier scholar, and he felt that he could get away with it, perhaps he could dismiss him. But Ibn Sina he could not dismiss because everybody accepted Ibn Sina as the best philosopher. On the other hand, Ghazali's opposition to some of the points that Avicenna makes in his philosophy was also appreciated. So Ibn Tufayl tries to create an intermediate position between Ghazali and Ibn Sina. And essentially, what I think he does there is tries to remystify the epistemological process that Ibn Sina had cleared up. I can give you the details later if you want, but the essence is that when it comes to getting information from on high, Ibn Sina is very clear about the mechanism from which our intellect receives information from the intellects of the spheres. And there is no obscurity in there. Ibn Tufayl, quoting Ibn al-Ghazali, who himself does this basically as well, he introduces an element which is not as clearly presented by al-Ghazali and which is not elaborated upon. So he remystifies this epistemological process. And I think that was done deliberately by Ibn Tufayl. As such, it is not in Ibn Sina. However, his influence was almost non-existent because very shortly after Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd, as you know, and Ibn Tumart, the Muslims in Al-Andalus in Spain were reduced to the little state of Granada in the south, and there was essentially no Islamic intellectual life left in Al-Andalus anymore. So there were no continuators of this line of transmission. This work, although it arrived to the East, but it was not very much appreciated because by the time in the East the philosophical discussion was moving at different planes. So it was the same thing with Ibn Rushd. That said, Ibn Rushd was not very influential in the East, although he was known. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, quotes him and talks about him. But again, Ibn Rushd's philosophy and also Ibn Tufayl were discussing things which were not of interest this time in the philosophical context of what was going on in the East. So we don't have a continuation of this line of tradition, but the continuation directly of the line of Ibn Sina. So that is the... and your second question was about? Yeah, he did. Yeah, that one was analyzed. There is an excellent book. But basically, as I said, Ibn Sina tried to present what his philosophy was in different styles for different audiences. And he thought he would write also an allegory, what we call an allegory, and he wrote the Ibn Yaksan, which was apparently based on some story available. Earlier, Hunayn has a story called Ibn Yaksan, etc. But what Ibn Sina does is precisely to express his own idea of the human intellect and its possible connection with the aql fa'al, with the active intellect of the lowest sphere, and then with the intellects of the other spheres and get information, except that instead of using philosophical language, he created this story as such. So the Ibn Yaksan is, of course, the human intellect, and all the development, all its adventures, so to speak, are precisely the ways in which the human intellect had gained access to information that comes from the supernal world, from the world above. There is an excellent book by one of the earliest and most serious researchers on Ibn Sina, the lady Guachon, a French lady, who wrote in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And she wrote a book specifically about this, where she takes Ibn Yaksan, the allegory, paragraph by paragraph, and compares everything with the Shifa and with the philosophy of Ibn Sina. And she shows that it follows basically word for word exactly what he says in that. So I can give you the reference, or if you don't have it now exactly, if you read French. But if you email me in, well, a few weeks, I'll be happy to give you the reference. No, that was actually a very, because Madame Guachon herself tried to show, although he did not completely exist, to show that there was not that much mysticism in that regard. And because people think of that in response to Corbin and because people think of the Haybn Yaksan as something mystical, to show that it is completely in agreement with the philosophical treatises, theories of Ibn Sina. Yes, sir, the one in the back. Yeah, and then the gentleman in front.
Konuşmanın başında kelamcıların atomculuğa biraz ilgilendiğini ve atomculuğu itikadi görüşlerin formülasyonunda bir base gibi, temel gibi kullandığını söylemiştiniz. Acaba daha sonra felsefecilerin biraz mistik bir tarafa kayması, tasavvufa kayması, atomculuk gibi bir görüşün kelamcılar, hani bunlar biraz düşman kardeş gibi düşünürsek, kelamcılar tarafından benimsenmiş olmasıyla alakalı mı? Çünkü Batı'daki hikayeye baktığımız zaman Antik Yunan'dan işte atomculuk Aristo etkisiyle tamamen altta kalıyor ve 15-16. yüzyıla kadar hiç görmüyoruz onu. Fakat burada tam tersine ana akım, yani institution olan yerde atomculuk benimseniyor. Bunun sonucunda mı acaba biraz da bu işte belki çok spekülatif ama bilimsel etkinliğin o anlamda burada şey bulmaması biraz bununla alakalı olabilir mi?
Güzel bir sual. Genel olarak hayır. Çünkü bu da felsefeciler ve kelamcılar arasındaki büyük bir farklılık bundan dolayıdır. Kelamcılar hep atomcul oldukları için felsefeciler hiç anlaşamadılar tabii. Onlar işte fizik, Aristo'nun fiziğiyle uğraşıyorlar tabii. Onun için bu fark daima devam ediyor. But the problem, I think, as you put it, is the question, the degree to which an understanding of causality, according to Aristotelian physical principles, which is opposed to that of an atomist causality, of an atomist cosmology as such, stopped being philosophically productive in later centuries in the Islamic world, exactly because of the prevalence of Asharite theology and the atomistic cosmology that it espoused. I don't know. This is a wonderful question, and it needs to be looked at, because there are only a few articles, one by Shlomo Pines, I think, about related to this question, as to why we do not have, in later centuries, more emphasis paid on this understanding of causality, because this is a basic point, of course, in science. If you have a causality in Aristotelian sense, then you do try to find out how things happen. But if you have an atomism or an Asharite atomism, what is called occasionalism in philosophy, as you know, in which God reshuffles atoms at every single instant, there is no causality to speak of. When I throw this bottle down, it will fall down simply because, not because there is gravity or whatever Aristotelian physics says, there is a direct cause of my going down, but because God, at this instant, he reshuffles the atoms and makes this fall down, simply because that is the habit of things, and he doesn't want to create, to confuse us. That was the standard Asharite response to this problem. Because if you say, well, if there is no real causality between my throwing it down and this falling down, then why every time I throw a bottle, it falls down and doesn't go up? And the Asharite response was, well, God is very nice. He doesn't want to confuse us. Because if things happened like this all the time, we wouldn't know what to do, obviously. So this, the harikul ade, this is to break the ada, to break the habit of things. But of course, the Asharites, by the same token, were able to explain miracles. Miracles are explained simply because God decides at that moment to put the atoms differently. But the prevalence of this may have had some influence on the fact that in later Islamic philosophy, we don't find causality as such being a central issue, and not, of course, influencing other scientific thinking, so in other sciences. This has not been studied. It would be a wonderful thing to study in later physics, in the works of later philosophers who write about natural science, and to see how they explain and how this works out. Wonderful. Please do work on that. That's a great question. That's, this is exactly, I'm sorry, this is exactly the kind of thing and method that I mean. We have to read the texts and see what it is those people are doing, whom they're arguing against, what the issue is that they're bringing about, you know, eliminating any preconceived ideas. Oh, these are Muslims, these are Christians, these are good, these are bad. You know, just see what those people are writing and what the social context was in which they were writing. The gentleman here in front. Efendim, sizin.
Hocam teşekkür ederim. Sanıyorum birkaç yerde duymuştum. Bunlardan bir tanesi Robert Wisnowski'de olabilir. Orada İbn Sina felsefesinin özellikle kaynaklarından birisi olarak kelamın altını çiziyordu. Sanıyorum özellikle Mutezile diye de belirtiyordu. Sizin bu konudaki ben düşüncelerinizi merak ediyorum. Yani felsefenin bu kadar sonraki dönemlerde işte 3 önemli disiplinin içinde merkezi bir noktayı teşkil etmesinde özellikle Mutezile kelamın ya da kelamcının etkisinde de bu konudaki ben düşüncenizi merak ediyorum.
No, this is Wisnowski's book is very important because precisely he does what I'm talking about, the centrality of philosophy. Philosophy was a discipline, as we say, as any philosophy, of rational thinking, not on any preconceived, transmitted or tenzil edilmiş or revealed ideas, to try to investigate reality. At the same time, it was also trying to, as scientists do, to explain the reality around it in the societies they were. Therefore, when you have theologians arguing certain positions, having certain positions, you don't want to neglect those, because if you do, then what you say will be irrelevant. You will be talking about something which is not of interest to anybody. So Wisnowski was able to show that certain problems that were discussed by the theologians are picked up by Ibn Sina as issues to be resolved, and he gives them the answers that he gives them in there. The answers, however, are in philosophical terms, not in theological terms, so to speak. They are the same way, as I said, the example that I gave with prophecy. All theological books discuss, of course, nubuwwat, how this happens, and Ibn Sina especially takes it very seriously, and he has his very elaborate psychological explanation as to how it is possible for prophets to receive information from Aql Fa'al, etc., and ultimately, of course, from the One. So from that point of view, the significance of philosophy is precisely this, that it was addressing problems that were of concern to the societies in which those philosophers worked. It was not something, perhaps our misunderstanding of philosophy right now, in that, oh, it is an academic discipline and only 10 philosophers in the universities talk about it, and the rest of society doesn't care. Philosophy was very much what we would call, again, as I said, the scientific approach to looking at reality, and therefore it had to deal with all the phenomena, all the things that we see around us. And especially Ibn Sina. For example, again, I mentioned the Isharat wa Tanbihat. The very last namat of that is called Fi Asrar al-Ayat, on the secret of signs, and has been taken to be mystical. Actually, of course, it is not at all mystical. He's trying to explain certain phenomena like evil eye, like foretelling the future, dreams that foretell the future, because these are experiences, as he says, experiences that we all have, and you know that they are true. I mean, I don't know now if we still believe that dreams can tell the future, but perhaps most of us do. But certainly in his time, it was a reality. The same thing with prophecy. Prophets do exist. Muhammad was a prophet. The question is not therefore to, as some people misunderstand, try to disprove prophecy. It was simply trying to do scientifically how prophecy is possible. Because according to the philosophers, if I say, well, I heard from my teacher and he heard from his teacher, etc., and you go back, this is not a scientific proof. This is simply hearsay, basically, as it is. So you have to find a scientific proof for that, and that's what he did for it. And the same thing with all the other issues, or the major. This, again, now is being discussed, and we still have to look at all of the metaphysics of Ibn Sina. We still have to look at all the natural science, the tabiyat of the Shifa, and try to find out what exactly it is that he's objecting to or he doesn't like, or what things are talked about in his time. and try to place him even more in his intellectual context. This is just beginning. I mean, Wisnowski's book is almost the very first one to discuss it at that detail about that. So please go ahead and continue with those works. Read the texts, you know, and compare them.
Soru kalmadı herhalde. İzin verirseniz son bir soru ben sormak istiyorum. Şimdi felsefenin entelektüel üretimde bir üst dil olduğu çok aşikar. Yani felsefe karşıtları bile, Gazali olsun, İbn Haldun olsun, felsefi terminolojiyi kullanmaktan beri durmuyorlar. Zaten onu kullanamazlarsa zannedersem yaptıkları işi yapamazlar. Fakat İbn Haldun mesela felsefeyi eleştirirken onların şöyle bir özelliklerini zikrederek eleştiriyor. Akıl varlığı bütün yönleriyle kuşatabilir diye düşündükleri için yanılıyorlar diyor. Şimdi eğer felsefenin alameti farikasını bu alırsak, yani felsefeyi bu düşünce üzerinden tanımlarsak, yine felsefenin merkeziliğinden bahsedebilir miyiz? Yani felsefi terminolojiyi, felsefi dili paranteze alırsak ve felsefeyi biraz önce söylediğim gibi o prensip üzerinden tanımlarsak yine İslam entelektüel geleneğinde felsefenin merkeziliğinden bahsedebilir miyiz?
For Ibn Khaldun, this is particularly important and interesting, and he certainly criticizes philosophers. Well, criticizes, he explains what they say, and then of course, well, he says this is not really correct, taking a traditional religious position. However, this also falls into the area in which Junaid was asking about, to what extent this is rhetoric and to what extent this is true. Because certainly if we look at what he is doing in the Muqaddimah, essentially he's a scientist himself. He looks at history from a scientific point of view, and indeed he looks at it from an Aristotelian point of view. He's very Aristotelian in that, and his understanding of the succession of history of states and of cultures and how one succeeds the other, and that at one point in the beginning of the metaphysics, Aristotle says that the ancient Egyptians were able to create a civilization because the caste of priests, did not have to work to earn a living themselves, and therefore they had the time and the leisure to look at philosophical questions, etc. And then, of course, one nation taking from another. This is completely also taken by Ibn Khaldun in his understanding of history. And as a matter of fact, when he comes to give us such brilliant sociological analyses, which are based on the fact that he says that civilization is based on the fact of having city life, and city life enables people to be free from having to grow their own food. So there is a division of labor, and again you have a class that is free from having to look after its own living, and therefore it is free to develop culture and do that. So in this he holds very much in that. So he understood exactly what the philosophers were saying, except that because by his time, especially in the West, in the Maliki tradition, there was a much more conservative approach by his time. He, again, because he was addressing a particular audience, he did not express himself perhaps as openly as that, although he does say that these sciences, which he means the sciences of culture and civilization, including philosophy, do not exist now, he says, in the Islamic world, and they are being cultivated in Europe. He mentioned among the Franks, meaning the Italians, and he was very much aware at the end of the 14th century that the universities were developing in Europe and that they were studying these issues, etc. So as I said, he had to express himself in a particular way. And it is also very interesting to see that he goes on for pages to explain the mechanism of city life or desert life, etc. And then in the end, he always says, Wallahu a'lam, that he says something like this. Well, of course, this is a given. So there is a certain rhetorical element, of course, to his exposition, I think. And of course, he may have disagreed with certain positions of Ibn Sina, obviously, in what he says. I don't know. But it is not a tradition that he, as a whole, or an approach, the rationalist approach of philosophy, and the great tradition itself that he disagrees with, because really he sees himself as part of that, in a sense. Although he says that in history, these people did not really do it for history. I'm the first one to do it, and rightly so. Yes, it is.
Peki, çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Ben de teşekkür ederim. Sağ olun.
Bu şehir konuşmalarının 4.'sünü bu şekilde tamamlamış olduk. Geldiğiniz için hepinize ayrıca teşekkür ediyorum.